This is Al Getz with Charting the Territories, and this is the Event Center looking at 1 week in Heart of America sports attractions, also known as Central States Wrestling, for the year 1971. We're going to take a look at all the known house shows we have records for run between Monday, December 6th, 1971, and Sunday, December 12th. And then we're going to take all that information and put it together on a spreadsheet and see if we can figure out how many shows we're missing. Now, one of the interesting things about this territory is that we do have fairly complete records from one of the three states they ran the majority of their shows in, and that is the state of Kansas. Through the State Athletic Commission's records, which are currently available at the Kansas State Archives, we're able to know pretty much to a fact, to a certainty, how many cards they ran in the state of Kansas. And in this particular sample week, they ran 4 cards in the state of Kansas. Monday, December 6th, they ran in Winfield. Tuesday, the 7th, Hutchinson. Thursday, the 9th, Kansas City. Interesting to note that usually when this promotion ran Kansas City, they ran a venue on the Kansas side. Kansas City is right on the border between Kansas and Missouri. Most of it is in Missouri, and I think most people equate Kansas City more with being in Missouri than in Kansas. But luckily for us, since we only have records for the state of Kansas, it works out very well that their cards were run on the Kansas side of Kansas City. And then finally, Sunday the 12th in Wichita, Kansas. Other cards, there were 2 in the state of Missouri, Tuesday in Sedalia, and Friday in St. Joseph. And then there were 3 cards in Iowa, Wednesday in Des Moines, and on Saturday in Waterloo, and Sunday in Cedar Rapids. So we start with Monday the 6th, where we have records for 1 card in Winfield, Kansas. Now here, we do not have an ad or results from the newspaper. The only information we have comes from the Kansas State Archives and the records of the Kansas Athletic Commission. And in this case, when they applied for a permit to run the show, they list all the wrestlers that are booked for that card. And generally, when they list it, they're in order. And we are usually, but not always, able to ascertain what the exact lineup was for the card. And in this case, the lineup consisted of 2 tag team matches, and there were more than likely 1 or 2 preliminary matches as well. These would be 1 fall matches involving some of the wrestlers that were in those tag team matches later. So the main event would have been Chad Yakuchi and Yasu Fuji taking on Rufus R. Jones and Bob Geigel, and the other tag team match was a women's match involving Betty Nicoli, Kay Noble, Barbara Galento, and Jean Davis. Now, Jean Davis also wrestled as Pat Davis and Rhonda Jean, and I think even a couple of other names. And depending on what city she was working in, even in this territory, sometimes her ring name would be different, but all of them can be traced back to Jean Davis. So there was 1 tag team match involving the male wrestlers, 1 tag team match involving the female wrestlers, and more than likely 1 or 2 singles bouts involving some of those wrestlers as a warm-up for the matches later on in the card. On Tuesday, December 7th, in Hutchinson, Kansas, the main event was a match for the Central States Heavyweight Championship with Harley Race taking on Pat O'Connor. So you have the current local heavyweight champion taking on the former world heavyweight champion. Also another ladies tag team match. Again, Betty Nicoli and Kay Noble versus Barbara Galento and Rhonda Davis, as well as Bob Geigel versus Apache Gringo, and then a singles warm-up match with Kay Noble against Rhonda Davis. Also on that same day in Sedalia, Missouri, the main event was an 8-man tag team match with Danny Littlebear, Omar Atlas, Terry Martin, and Rufus R. Jones versus Chad Yakuchi, Yasu Fuji, Tor Kamada, and Benny Ramirez. And then the 3 opening matches were, again, 1 fall warm-up bouts involving some of the wrestlers that were in the main event 8-man tag. Here we have Terry Martin versus Betty Ramirez, Omar Atlas versus Chadi Yakuchi, and Rufus R. Jones versus Tor Kamada. Also, we see on this ad our referee is Ronnie Etchison. On Wednesday, December 8th in Des Moines, Iowa, main event was Harley Race versus the Stomper, and this ad is a little hard to read, but the match has a 90-minute time limit, which almost certainly means that they had gone to a previous time limit draw. It's also a lumberjack match, and again, the layout of this ad is a little weird, but the lumberjack match almost certainly applied to the main event and not the tag team match below it. And as a matter of fact, if you look closely where it states the rules for the lumberjack match, it says 8 wrestlers will be stationed around the ring. If either wrestler jumps out or is thrown out, they'll be thrown back in. So that makes it almost certainly that this stipulation applied to Harley Race versus the Stomper and not the semi-main event tag team match, which was Chadi Yakuchi and Yasu Fuji versus Rufus R. Jones and Bob Geigel. And then 3 other matches on the card: Steve Bolus versus Benny Ramirez, Bob Orton, and this would be Bob Orton Sr. versus Omar Atlas, and Apache Gringo versus Terry Martin. On Thursday, December 9th in Kansas City, Kansas, he is ready as Danny Little Bear tangles with Harley Race for the title, this case being the Central States heavyweight title. Also a tag team match with the Stomper and the Viking versus Chadi Yakuchi and Yasu Fuji. 6-man tag team action with Rufus R. Jones, Bobby Whitlock, and Omar Atlas against Apache Gringo, Bob Orton Sr., and Benny Ramirez. Tor Kamada versus Steve Bolus, plus more, according to this advertisement. And based on the results from the card, that plus more is one fall warm-up match involving 2 of the wrestlers who were in that 6-man tag. It ended up being Whitlock and Apache Gringo. On Friday, December 10th in St. Joseph, Missouri, Central States title match, Harley Race defending against the Stomper. Also in tag team action, Rufus R. Jones teams with the Viking to take on Chadi Yakuchi and Yasu Fuji. Omar Atlas versus Tor Kamada. Ronnie Etchison against Bob Orton Sr., and Apache Gringo versus Terry Martin. On Saturday the 11th in Waterloo, Iowa, main event, a death bout, which is a Texas death match. Harley Race versus the Stomper. And a ladies tag team match, Barbara Galento and Pat Davis versus Kay Noble and Betty Nicolai. And of course, it might be pronounced Nicoli. I'm not 100% positive, but Betty, either way, is in this tag team match. And Ronnie Etchison versus Frank Diamond, plus a warm-up match with Betty against Barbara Galento, and the opening match is Bob Orton Sr. against Terry Martin. In the first of 2 cards we have records for Sunday the 12th, this one in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Main event was for the Central States title, Harley Race, defending against Ronnie Etchison, and the semi-main was a 6-man tag as Bob Orton, Tor Kamada, and Frank Diamond faced Pat O'Connor, Omar Atlas, and Terry Martin. And then there were 3 opening matches, which, as you see, are prelim 1-fall bouts involving the wrestlers in the 6-man tag. O'Connor against Orton, Kamada against Atlas, and Diamond against Martin. The other card on Sunday the 12th in Wichita featured a North American tag team title match with Yakuchi and Fuji against the Stomper and Rufus R. Jones. Another tag match with Bob Geigel and the Viking against Apache Gringo and Benny Ramirez, and then a ladies tag team match with Rhonda Davis and Barbara Galento versus Kay Noble and Betty Nicolai, plus 2 other bouts. And again, those 2 other bouts were almost certainly preliminary warm-up matches involving the wrestlers in the tag team bouts. So all in all, we have records for 9 cards held in the territory during the week, but we're almost certain that that's not complete, and we're going to use a little bit of what I call data magic to try and estimate exactly how complete we believe this might be. So this is a spreadsheet I put together listing all the wrestlers booked on these towns for this week. Baby faces are on the left, and they're listed in descending order based on their average position on the cards at this time, and heels are on the right. The lady wrestlers are listed at the bottom. Also, you'll see on the babyface side, Pat O'Connor, who was used on a part-time basis at this point in time, is listed separately from the main crew, though it's also worth noting that several or maybe not several, but a couple of other baby faces, in particular, Hutchinson, Whitlock, and even to some extent Geigel, were not booked every single night of the week that the territory ran cards. Hutchinson and Whitlock were part-time. We saw in one of the ads earlier in the week that Hutchinson was a referee instead of wrestling for one of the cards. It's also possible Whitlock served the same role. And Geigel, at this point in time, is part owner of the territory, so he is fortunate enough to be able to work a reduced schedule as well. Now, we know for the Monday, we only have records for that one card in Winfield, Kansas, and you can see on both the left and right hand sides of this spreadsheet, I made note of which wrestlers were booked in Winfield with just the abbreviation WIN. So Rufus and Geigel, as well as the two women wrestlers on the babyface side, and Yakuchi and Fuji, and the two ladies on the heel side. Clearly, there are enough wrestlers unbooked to have at least one other card, and quite honestly, there might have been two. If you look at particularly the heels, Harley Race, Tor Kamada, Benny Ramirez, Bob Orton, Frank Diamond, and Apache Gringo were all unbooked. So it's very possible you could have had two cards in small towns with 6 wrestlers on each, 3 heels and 3 baby faces. The Stomper, the Viking, Danny Little Bear, Omar Atlas, and some of the other baby faces are all unbooked as well. So there's at least one and perhaps even 2. On Tuesday, we have records for 2 cards. And here, when you look at, particularly on the babyface side, there are several wrestlers unbooked. So you may be tempted to say, oh, well, they definitely ran another card. But when you look at the heel side, because there are more baby faces than heels, there are only 2 wrestlers unbooked, and that's Bob Orton and Frank Diamond. And in the case of Diamond, similar to Hutchinson and Whitlock and O'Connor, he's probably not a 6-7 night a week guy in this territory at this time. So the fact that he's not booked doesn't necessarily mean he had to have been booked somewhere else. So it's possible that the preliminary wrestler, Frank Diamond, wasn't booked anywhere, and they gave Bob Orton the night off, as well as a few of the babyfaces. However, when you go back and look at the babyface side and see who's unbooked, you do have the Stomper, the Viking, and Steve Bolus as far as full-time wrestlers that were not booked. So possibly there was another card on this day. I'm not 100% positive. On Wednesday, looking at the wrestlers booked in Des Moines, again, several babyfaces not booked and only a couple of heels not booked. And here it's Kamada and Diamond, with one little wrinkle, and that is the lady wrestlers are not booked on this night. Now, typically, when the special attractions, the female wrestlers or the little persons came to a territory, they'd be booked every single night of the week because they're just in, they traveled far to get there. They're in for a week or 2 weeks. They're pretty much going to be booked solid. But in this case, the women wrestlers were based in St. Joseph, Missouri. So they're based in the territory. So they don't necessarily need to be booked every night. It's more a matter of if the promotion had only one card booked for a particular night, they might not use the women. But if they had 2, they probably would if they were available. So here, the fact that the lady wrestlers aren't booked on Wednesday doesn't mean there had to have been another show, but it's a slight hint that that might have been the case. And again, this would have been a small card featuring the ladies and Tor Kamada and maybe Frank Diamond on the heel side, along with a few of the baby faces who aren't booked in Des Moines. That would be the Viking, Hutchinson, Whitlock, and O'Connor. And also want to note here, in the case of Danny Little Bear, I believe that there was either a legitimate or storyline injury, because we see he's not booked steadily, particularly later in the week. He's not booked anywhere on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. He was advertised for the Thursday show in Kansas City, but you'll see it shaded in a little shade of pink. That's because he actually didn't appear, and Pat O'Connor took his place. So the fact that Little Bear's not booked on Wednesday because he was injured, they might have, not had him anywhere. So again, just like Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe another card, but I'm not positive. And in the case of Thursday, the Kansas City shows were typically an all-hands-on-deck show. They almost never ran a second show on Thursday. But again, that doesn't mean they never did, because from time to time, they certainly did. And here, again, we can see the only heel wrestler unbooked is Frank Diamond, although again, the lady wrestlers are available. So highly unlikely there was another show with only one preliminary heel available, but perhaps they ran a small show somewhere with a ladies tag and then Diamond against one of the baby faces like Geigel or Hutchinson or Terry Martin. Who knows? Friday in St. Joseph, again, a small number of wrestlers unbooked, Benny Ramirez and Frank Diamond on the heel side, the lady wrestlers, as well as a few baby faces, Geigel, the possibly injured Little Bear, Steve Bolus, and Bobby Whitlock and Pat O'Connor. Now, a lot of times when they ran St. Joseph on Fridays, some of the wrestlers would be booked for St. Louis, which ran approximately every 3 weeks. There wasn't a St. Louis card this week, so who knows? And which reminds me, I want to go back to Thursday in Kansas City, because you look and see that Barbara Galento was booked for Joe Dusick in Nebraska, which makes it slightly less likely that this territory would have had another card, because now they can't even have the ladies tag because one of the women wrestlers is working somewhere else. Looking at Saturday, we have records for one card in Waterloo, Iowa. We also know that a few of the wrestlers who were primarily booked in this territory were working for other shows. Tor Kamada, Benny Ramirez, and Bobby Whitlock worked a show for Joe Dusick that night, and the Viking worked in Joplin, Missouri for McGurk. But even taking those wrestlers off the table, there are still enough wrestlers unbooked that there was likely another show on Saturday in a small town. You can see on the heel side, Yakuchi and Fuji were not booked, nor was Apache Gringo. And on the babyface side, you have Rufus R. Jones, Steve Bolus, Omar Atlas, as well as the part-timers Geigel and O'Connor, and possibly the injured Danny Little Bear. So I think it's pretty safe to say there was one additional card on Saturday. On Sunday, we have records for 2 cards in Cedar Rapids and in Wichita. And if you look on the heel side, all the wrestlers working in this territory were booked on one of those 2 cards. And the only baby faces unbooked are the possibly injured Danny Little Bear, Steve Bolus, and the part-timers Bobby Whitlock. And that's it. So highly unlikely there was an additional card on Sunday. So now we have a better idea of what we might be missing. We have confirmed 9 cards in the territory. We are probably missing 1 or 2 on Monday. We might be missing 1 on Tuesday, but we're not sure. We might be missing 1 on Wednesday, but we're not sure. We're almost certainly not missing any on Thursday. We might be missing 1 on Friday, and we're definitely missing 1 on Saturday. So given all that information, that now you can see how the 9 shows were probably more like 12 to 14 shows run overall, which means we're missing anywhere from 25 to 35% of the records for this particular week. I hope you enjoyed this look at 1 week in the life of the Central States Wrestling Territory in 1971. For more about this territory in 71, be sure to visit A Year in the Life at chartingtheterritories.com. You can also see more of these event centers for different territories by subscribing to our YouTube channel, and a whole host of information at chartingtheterritories.com and on our monthly podcast, Charting the Territories, that comes out the second Thursday of each and every month. For Charting the Territories, this is Al Getz, thanking you for joining us.